общаться с людьми, которые из других областей знания. Он будет говорить по-английски, потому что это официальный язык симпозиума, и потому что он не говорит по-русски. Если вы хотите что-нибудь резюмировать по-русски после его выступления, может быть, я сделаю, если будут такие вопросы. The floor is yours.
Je mets debout. C'est mieux?
C'est mieux, c'est comme vous voulez. Si vous voulez, on peut comme ça.
I hope that everybody speaks English or understands English, and I try to be as clear as possible to present a psychoanalytic reading of Dostoevsky, who is, that's my point of departure, writing for a time for which God is dead. It is what Nietzsche states exactly at the same moment in the second half of the 19th century, in a different context and with other means. The other common point of the two authors is the place they give tragedy in their writing and thought, the one by exploring and rereading its Greek origins, and the other by developing, producing a new, genuine Russian version of the tragic. Dostoevsky is the representative of a very Russian version of the tragic, similar to the Western one, and nevertheless so different. Severely repressed under the Soviet regime, it is re-emerging today with a reinforced intensity. As an indispensable and crucial factor, it has to be taken in account in order to give the country's historical, cultural and religious background a new evidence. Lenin's hatred of the author underlines the necessity to reconsider the Dostoevskian tragic in its genuine political as well as spiritual dimension. Coming back to the 19th century determines the approach of the traumas of the 20th century and the invention of the future on a different basis. It is one, the Russian version of the tragic, which Dostoevsky has experienced unwillingly, as imposed to him by political circumstances in the first time, but which appeared progressively in the very center of his life, his spiritual research and political thinking. He dedicated his life to a writing process which consists mainly in exploring the Russian soul in its difference to the Western one. The soul is that of ordinary people whose destiny he explores in his great novels, a destiny which is determined by a new social, economic and political pressure, by living together in bigger conglomerations and cities appearing in the 18th and 19th century. Literature is the favorite place, level mentioned, where a social change can be addressed, explored and elaborated. The Russian situation is characterized by the delay in industrialization and the predominance of the country life of agrarian economy. By the repression by Tsarist monarchy and the privileges of aristocracy, the huge influence of the rule of a reactionary, ultra-conservative government. All that belongs to the Dostoevskian world, against which and for which he was fighting his whole life. His literary work testifies of the deep changes which took place as well in society and in man. He's eager of the newness and afraid of it, because he belongs at the same time to the new and to the old world, condemned to disappear. He feels equally attracted and horrified by modern European society, transformed by industrialization, capitalism and liberalism, which nonetheless delivers the reference point to compare it to the pureness of the Russian soul. It is his profession of faith, the point of resistance to modernity or certain aspects of it. How to preserve tradition in the turbulences of time under the threat to lose the most essential portion of it, something which is more important than even life itself. Is it worthful to sacrifice an individual for the salvation of mankind, for the redemption's sake? It is part of his logic, his reasoning, concerning above all the place and the importance he gives the children's pain. To save tradition means, first of all, to reappropriate it and to transform it. It will be never the same, but its reformulation, its rearticulation under the pressure of time may lead to a pureness, a radicality, an originality which were never reached before. Dostoevsky is the man to do this. One of the very few in the 19th century, with Nietzsche and before Freud, to push the exploration of the human soul to its boundaries and beyond, its extremities, which are tragic. It is a question of interpretation. Dostoevsky writes in his journal that often he's falsely considered as a psychologist, but that he's not, that he's rather a realist. His descriptions of man's soul, his extravagances and irrationalities are so realistic that they appeared to be a strange and sometimes amazing copy of actual events related in the newspapers, which gives his vision a realistic as well as a prophetic dimension. His realism, which breaks with the idealism and psychology of his time, is very close to Freud's one and nevertheless so different. The two have in common to break with psychology, which, with regard to the tragic dimension in man, which is essential for the two authors, a dimension which finds its ground in psychology, be it scientific or not. The speech about the psychology of the tragical character is merely conventional, whereas the latter is far beyond that what could be reached by the former, by psychology. Tragedy is for Dostoevsky and Freud the real which cannot be grasped, seized by the means of scientific rationality, but requires a new poetic dimension, discourse, to which belong Dostoevsky's novels and Freudian psychoanalysis. As a psychoanalyst, I consider the soul, or psyche, from the point of view of the unconscious, determined by an extraordinary richness which can never be reached by any means, by any conscious thinking. A richness which is like an abyss of an immeasurable depth. There is a measure, of course, but of another rationality, which has still to be defined. As a Freudian, I say, it is the rationality of the unconscious, which Freud developed in his first major works, and Dostoevsky in his great novels, under different circumstances and in another context, scrutinizing within the smallest details which occur in ordinary people's mind or soul. But with his attention, his focus, makes it extraordinary and abnormal. He's not interested in the pathology of mind or soul, but in what anormality tells us about the norm, beyond what is considered as the norm. Dostoevsky teaches us, differently from Freud, that normality doesn't exist, but that a norm occurs only as anormal, as extraordinary in the singularity of the subject. Or in other terms, close to the Freudian terminology, that ontogenesis, that means the individual development of a norm, always is preceding phylogenesis, the emergence of a norm in the species. The notion of the unconscious is representative for the abyss, the unrepresentable in modern society, the immeasurable as the ground of any measure, any order, be it scientific, political, or ethical. Insofar, Dostoevsky was preparing the path Freud had just to follow, referring to Nietzsche's formula of the re-evaluation of all values, Umwertung aller Werte. Modern epistemology focuses on the difference between facts and values, which leads one of the most important epistemologies of recent times, Hilary Putnam, a Harvard professor, in one of his last books, to state the end of the fact-value dichotomy. It is the best definition of what one could call the Dostoevskian realism. Because he is interested in facts, he exposes nothing else than facts and acts, and crime as the superior act and fact, the most superior of which is parricide, to which is dedicated his last and most important novel, The Brothers Karamazov, which I call a tragedy of our time, the modernity, the actuality of which has to be redefined, reconsidered. The level where the tragedy takes place is that of the unconscious. It is the contribution of psychoanalysis to a reactualized reading of Dostoevsky's contribution to our knowledge of present time. Contrary to its usual understanding, the unconscious is not confined to the inner world, but constitutes an unprecedented link between the inner and the outside world. Exactly what Dostoevsky's writing demonstrates, the intimate relationship between the two, exposed in the most radical way by the importance the status he gives to the crime, one could say as the enactment of the evil, which, with all its legal consequences, misachievements and misunderstandings. His very description of facts, often presented as news items, faits divers, corresponds to the exposure to an inner, ineffable value, too great, too radical or horrible to be described in words. In these categories, parricide appears to be the very essence, the quintessence of the evil, and seems to be the masterpiece in Dostoevsky's demonstration of the monstrosities in man and of our time. It is an essential part of his philosophy for the time to come. First of all, we have to consider that it is the cornerstone of his last novel, and as such plays a huge role in the architecture of his whole oeuvre. Secondly, it reproduces the inner essence of the Greek tragedy exposed in Sophoclean, in its Sophoclean version in King Oedipus, and also of the Elizabethan tragedy exposed in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Who is the murderer of the father in the Brother Karamazov? Each of the three sons has his own reasons to do so. The most important is the context, which we have to focus on. Dostoevsky adds a major factor that cannot be found neither in Sophocles or in Shakespeare, which is the dimension of liberty, of freedom, constitutive of our understanding of modern subjectivity, and the new version of an old theological question of the free will, as a variation on the well-known theme. The crime perpetrated, consciously or not, appeared on the unconscious level, which is an essential part of the crime, insofar as the perpetrator usually doesn't know exactly what he does, and he's unaware of the depth of the inner reason, meaning of his acts. But the unconscious doesn't contradict the idea of freedom. There may be a retroactive denial of the subject's responsibility in the crime, exactly what takes place at court, and above all, before the inner court, the instance which Dostoevsky is dealing with. If he speaks about the court, it is always an inner court, the sentence of which is much severer, more radical than any court of law or judicial body in the exterior world. It is the psychoanalyst's everyday job to deal with these inner sentences which condemn and punish the individual in such a severe way that apparently there's no way out. His intervention consists in suggesting, proposing a reinterpretation of the sentence, which is not so easy to do. To escape a sentence, the subject becomes sententious, moralizing, which clinically has to be avoided. It is more successful to try to introduce a void in that what is too meaningful, which is a way to invalidate a sentence or even law itself. But the result of an invalidated sentence is very often the emergence of an even more severe, strict and harsh sentence. What I'm describing is the function of the superego, in Freud's terms, the agency of an inner court which causes the analytic process a lot of trouble. The superego is like a third agency, authority, which is always present, commenting, judging the subject's speech and thoughts, even during his sleep, forbidding even that what is allowed. Dostoevsky's question is also, what is allowed? What is law? What is allowed when everything is forbidden? What is the authority which forbids? Is it God? Is it law? Ultimately referred to God? What happens if God is dead? Is everything allowed, as Alyosha says, or forbidden, as Lacan states? Who decides? Which authority has the power of decision? For man, it is essential to have the choice to do the evil, at least in principle, according to the fundamental rule of his freedom. The evil can only be defined by law, but it is also true to say that law requires the evil to exist itself. That law is defined by what is outlaw. Could we say the same thing about God? That he comes only into existence as the ultimate reference point of law by man's choice of the evil, by his liberty to do so. It is a modern version of tragedy, a variation of an ancient well-known theme, that the father's murder installs him as a symbolic agency, that parricide is the cornerstone, la clé de voûte, of a symbolic architecture determining the world in which we live. Tragedy as such is like a huge scenario taking place simultaneously on different levels of stages, art, religion, politics, and so on, creating a knot between all the fields of human life, which has to be renewed and redefined, rearticulated from time to time. The most important in the idea of the knot is that it corresponds to a very precise structure, transforming an event or an act in an overdeterminate one, raising the question of man's destiny, of what is beyond, or of what occurs beyond the singularity of his acts. Beyond the artistic enactment in Dostoevsky, we have to consider its religious and political dimensions. His artistic, literary performance transformed him more than any other author of his time in a religious and political thinker, scholar, and writer. Some speak of Dostoevsky's theology. Why not to speak about his political philosophy? He's creating the conditions of a re-evaluation of the social political dimension in the Russia of the late 19th century. His great novels can be read, at least partially, as essays, dissertations on religious and political philosophy from a practical as well as a theoretical point of view. It is an essential part of Dostoevsky's writing process, pushed to its boundaries, corresponding to an inner, intrinsic limitation in writing, recurring in any writing system. It is the way Lacan defines censorship, the political dimension of which Freud has exposed since the interpretation of dreams. Censorship, be it artistic, political, religious, is an instance which is constantly at work in Dostoevsky's writing. It is not only imposed by the outside world, social life, the political regime, but in a more radical way by the inner world, by what drives the individual as an instance, authority, opposed close to his drive activity. It is Freud's definition of the evil, drive activity, and plays as such a major role in Dostoevsky's writing, dedicated to the exposure of the evil in all its dimensions. Lacan defines drive activity, le pulsionnel, das Triebhafte, as the real psychoanalysis has to deal with. Dostoevsky exposes its spiritual and political dimensions in elaborating a knot between the evil, the search of God, and human freedom. Not everything is allowed if God doesn't exist, but the evil which characterizes man in his essence is the condition of his liberty and of God's existence as well. It is not too late to quote Berdyaev, the existence of evil is a proof of the existence of God. If the world consisted wholly and uniquely of goodness and righteousness, there would be no need for God, for the world itself would be good or God. God is because evil is. And that means that God is because freedom is. End of the quotation. George Steiner evokes the supreme liberty of the criminal act, the function of which is to require a new legal order and a re-evaluation of God's position, different from its institutional status and beyond its purely religious understanding. Facing the death of his own anxiety, despair, and irrationality, Dostoevsky is preparing the ground of a new trust and confidence based only on the faith in words and speech, the basis of a new rationality announcing Freud's unconscious and the time to come. Thank you very much.
на 10 минут, может быть.
Can I ask a question? Thank you very much for your presentation. At one point you said a thing that seems to be very interesting and intriguing. You said that unlike in Freud, the Dostoevsky world doesn't have an established norm, which actually seems to be true. But I would like to ask you to clarify what do you mean by saying that? It's like I just didn't quite understand. So does it mean like it is determined individually, or like an individual finds his or her own norm? Or, I mean, I just didn't catch it. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yeah.
That seems to be a very interesting point.
Yeah, that is a point on which I'm working since a long time. So it appears regularly in what I develop. And that means that, and first of all, I was interested in this question from a medical point of view. Maybe that somebody knows the French epistemologist Canguilhem, Georges Canguilhem, who wrote the famous book about the normal and the pathological, which was translated in English, but it's not so often quoted and considered in the English-speaking world, but essential for the French thought, and also medical thought, but which has influenced all types of thought in other fields, and above all the social and the political field. That means that, for example, I have to quote an author which everybody knows, Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault is his most important pupil. He made his dissertation with Canguilhem, And the question of the norm, of normality, is the kernel point, the main reference point in his whole work. So to come back to your question, is to say that the norm doesn't exist in itself, but there are endless variations, versions of the norm. And it is what the analyst experiences in his everyday job, and it's very important for him to have a precise notion of normality. Because otherwise, and that is a huge criticism which could be addressed to psychology and psychiatry as well, to try to reduce the individual to a certain normality, to normalize, which normally psychoanalysis has not to do. The richness of literature, and above all of Dostoevsky's writing, is to show the difference to the norm. And his genius has to do with that, in this difference, and nevertheless to show the main difference is the creation of the evil. And to show, nevertheless, that this difference to the norm is essential. That life takes place, the life of the individual takes place in this difference between a so-called norm, which is very often an ideal, and the difference he creates. Everybody present in this room is creating his own norms, but in a difference to a certain normality. So there's that have also to make the distinction between the close relationship and nevertheless the essential distinction between the individual and the social consideration. Society has to consider that certain norms exist. Our legal system is based on that there are norms. But the norm doesn't function by itself. Therefore, the norm has to be interpreted, reinterpreted. And that is the function of the court. Therefore, we have a whole legal system, because the norm doesn't, the norm itself isn't enough. The norm has to be reinterpreted. But what takes place on the social level, on the level of the legal bodies, the court of law, is only the reproduction of that what takes place on the level of an inner court, and which is, as I try to show, and based also on clinical experience, this inner court is much severer, harsher, stricter. It's terrible.
Thank you. That's a very interesting idea, because, does it seem close to what Deleuze says about difference then? About difference.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, when he says there are things that are different from something, yes, but this something is not different from the difference, yes. It's sort of like that.
Deleuze explores a similar idea on another level and with other means.
Okay, thank you. Just to make it clear.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, good, thank you.
Some other questions? Thank you. It was so interesting that I'm not sure that I can understand all the deepness of your relation. But you said that Dostoevsky belonged to the Dostoevsky belongs to the old and the new word in the same time, and this pertains and his the resistance to modernity in Dostoevsky. And do you think that just this resistance to modernity is maybe a character of modernity itself?
There's no doubt that he splits between two worlds, and he belongs to the two worlds, and he is well aware that under the pressure of time something is lost, inevitably lost, and the more the deeper he feels it, the more he's convinced that something has to be saved. But he's only one representative of that huge question in what tradition consists. What is tradition? That is a huge question for everybody. So even if I say, that's not my problem, tradition, I am a modern man, no. I have my own tradition, my own family tradition, and I cannot get rid of it so easily. It's a huge effort to this work on the tradition. And the tradition has to do always with the loss. And all generations have to find with that loss of the tradition. And all parents are convinced that their children, they have forgotten everything that they have lost. And how my child has forgotten everything, what was important in my life. And it's something new which begins, so it's a real difficulty. Above all, for somebody like Dostoevsky, and that is his greatness. He felt responsible for the Russian tradition. That is extraordinary.
Do you think that this question about tradition and what could be saved is connected with the transmission? What could be saved and also transmitted to the others, or in time, survive in time?
Yes, the two questions are linked together, of course, tradition and transmission. What is transmitted, it's, of course, there's a content which has to be transmitted, or which one feeds that is necessary to be transmitted. But already the transmission is transforming it. Even in teaching, teaching transforms the subject we are teaching. It's not exactly the same as you have learned it, you received it. By transmitting it, you are transforming it and deforming it. It's a creation of something new. It's a question of the newness to which Dostoevsky was confronted. The newness of the taking place on the social level.
Some other comments, questions? Thank you very much for your presentation, and immediately